How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to set 6, and today we're going to be continuing the discussion from the previous video where we looked at Jenova. In this one, I want to look at one thing in particular, and that thing is Jenova's relationship with Sephiroth and where the power lies in this pairing. Now, this in itself is going to cover a few other questions. Was Jenova ever a conscious being? Was Jenova killed by the Cetra when they sealed Jenova away? How far does Jenova's mimicry ability go? Things like that. So we're going to go back to the way that I used to do these videos back in the day. It's been a while since I did an actual theory video. It's more been like the character breakdowns like we just did with Jenova. And the way we do it is I present 3 possibilities, what I believe to probably be the 3 most likely possibilities, and see if we can figure out what's going on with Jenova and Sephiroth. Don't forget, drop a like on the video, subscribe for future content. It helps. We're getting real close now. We're like 120 away from 1k. We can get there. We can get there. I want to get there. Get there by the end of the year. Get to 1k by the end of the year. I mean, if we can do it faster than that, that's better. But, you know, that's the goal. But anyway, let's get on with it. This possibility, in my opinion, is probably the most boring of the outcomes that we're going to look at today. This pretty much takes all of the responsibility and the agency away from Sephiroth and puts everything on the toes of Jenova. Now, whether this means that she's actually taken full control of Sephiroth and is basically puppeting him around, or if she's somehow subjugated Sephiroth, I'm not too sure which way it could go. It's possible that she's taken full control of Sephiroth and is like using that genetic material to puppet him, but I think the most likely option is that it's kind of a combination of the two, using that genetic material and her ability to control him maybe in short bursts. She's subjugated Sephiroth pretty much entirely. Now, this relies on Jenova being a conscious life form, something with like active intelligence. And another thing that this would guarantee would be that the big bad at the end of the game would be Jenova rather than Sephiroth. And this is kind of why I don't like this theory that much. I can't see a world where Sephiroth isn't the final bad guy. I've seen a lot of people saying that Jenova is going to be the final bad guy, but that's pretty awful, in my opinion. I mean, they could do it in a way that's brilliant, you never know. But to me, that's not the best. So I don't really like this theory. I don't like the complete absolution of any responsibility or anything for Sephiroth. I don't like that. Okay, so this is the one that's probably got the most variables running through it, and it's potentially the most compelling. It elevates Sephiroth into even more of a threat. The man who was experimented on before even being born and turned into a hybrid human Jenova life form, he's now taken control of the genetic legacy that he has within him. But there are 2 pretty big questions that come along with this theory. First off is how did he do it? And the second is when did the dynamic change? Because there has to be a crossover point. Let's start with the how. Now, this would be one of 2 things, and you're going to hear me say that a lot in this video. One of two things. Like, I'm giving possibilities here. But the first of these is that Sephiroth gradually acclimates to the effect of Jenova's cells, and the control being exerted on him diminishes as he regains his strength, or maybe not even regains his strength, as he grows stronger. That's the easy answer. But it's got a few holes of it, such as why was Sephiroth not showing signs of being controlled by Jenova prior to the Nibelheim incident? Because he wasn't, he was just a normal, decent guy from everything that we've seen. And also, why is this future Sephiroth that we see in Remake seemingly in control if this is the case? Because if we assume that this is a future Sephiroth, then it's probably a post-Advent Children Sephiroth. And post-Advent Children, Sephiroth's probably weaker than he's ever been after yet another defeat at the hands of Cloud. So if this is a post-Advent Children Sephiroth, wouldn't Jenova be in charge? You know, if it was a fluid dynamic where, depending on who's got the stronger power or will or whatever it turns out to be, if it is that fluid dynamic, you'd assume that after Advent Children, Jenova would probably reassert itself as the dominant force. And even if you don't think future Jenova would have taken charge, if Sephiroth has been defeated by Cloud, he's been weakened, then he's come back. He's now come back into the domain of a stronger Jenova, and the cells are the same. You know, Jenova should be able to control Jenova cells whichever time frame they're from. But yeah, if Sephiroth comes back to the time of Remake, then if he's weak after Advent Children, he would just fall straight under the control of the Jenova that exists in Remake's timeline. So yeah, I'm not 100% on this. It comes down to how strong Sephiroth is. Which then leads me to the next possibility. And this other method is, rather than Sephiroth being stronger and more powerful, It comes down to him being more stable and more controlled and more centered. That might sound a bit daft, but let's break it down. I touched on it briefly in the previous video. Most of the people that we've seen that have been affected by Jenova in a particularly adverse way have had some sort of issue going on in their life that has affected them emotionally, in the short or long term. Cloud, an emotional mess throughout his life, almost obliterated by Jenova's cells several times over. The Cetra, they saw their loved ones being consumed and used to trick them, massive short-term emotional impact that J.E.N.O.V.A could use as a way to take control and make the situation even worse. Shinra test subjects, they were either kidnapped or, like we see in some of the side stories, they were people who were coerced into completing dangerous missions for the company, and then they were used for experiments afterwards. But there were people that were probably not in the best of situations anyway, and that's why they've allowed themselves to go into these pretty haphazard and stupid missions that Shinra are putting out there. And even Sephiroth, his entire life turned out to be a lie. Prior to this, Sephiroth was a shining example of what a soldier could be, a hero who saved and protected the world, who won the war against Wu-Tai almost single-handedly, a god near enough. But then he learns the truth of his origins, and he not only loses control mentally, but he seemingly falls under the control of Jenova at this stage. He changes entirely after this event, and this potentially facilitates Jenova beginning to use Sephiroth to her own ends. Now, if this is the case, maybe the way for Sephiroth to break the shackles of Jenova is to become more complete and more centered and more stable in his own mindset, to reconcile his feelings and mindset around how he was created. But would it make any difference? Probably not. Even if Sephiroth is to break free of Jenova by asserting his own consciousness, would his plans change at this point? And to balance this possibility out, the one person that we know of to resist Jenova when being tested on by Hojo is Zack, who is possibly the most well-put-together and pure-hearted individual in the entire Final Fantasy VII franchise. So it makes complete sense, if this is the case, that Jenova had little to no effect on him due to how solid his mindset and mentality is. It's an interesting one though. It could explain why we see Sephiroth kind of changing from RA to Watasha at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, because after he's absorbed all of that power, because you see him absorb it all just before the final fight, once he's done that, he's kind of able to reassert himself mentally, and that's why we see that switch. He's got all of his memories back, because we see it when we read through things like Livestream Black, about how Sephiroth's consciousness is kind of fading away and he has to kind of focus on a few specific points and a few specific facts of himself, basically. If he's absorbed all of that from the future live stream, the events that have already happened from his perspective, he has completed himself again almost, and therefore he would take that position of power and assert control and not essentially be a puppet to Jenova. He would be himself again. Like I say, it's an interesting one. It's a very interesting one, and it's probably the most likely. But it does bring the question of how conscious a being is Jenova? Like, what is Jenova actually trying to do? Is Jenova a conscious, intelligent being, or is it just essentially a cluster of cells with a primal instinct that overpowers everything unless that person is strong-willed, strong-minded? Do you know what I mean? It could be either of those things. I'm 50-50 on what the deal with Jenova is as far as being an actual life form is anyway. But we'll dive into that in the next one. Now, I know I said that there was only going to be 3 possibilities for this, but I kind of feel like I have to throw a 4th in as well. So we're halfway there. We're halfway there. Yep, neither is in charge. Both of them have almost become one and the same being now, inseparable. This could explain Jenova's original body, if you buy into the possibility from the previous video where I discussed the Jenova body that we see in Final Fantasy VII potentially being one of the Cetra that were corrupted by Jenova. This could mean that Jenova is a virus or some other form of life form that relies on taking over, or at the very least existing within the systems of other life forms, like a parasite of some sort. And with Jenova not really having a body of their own, more like being a collection of cells, probably not with intelligent consciousness, but at the very least some sort of primal instincts that determine its behaviour in general, it opens up some interesting possibilities, and there are some indications that possibly point towards this. When we talk about Jenova, we know that Jenova made a journey from the previous planet, came to Gaia, then tried to take over the Cetra, was defeated, imprisoned, and now is basically a subject of experimentation. But what if that original body that we see of Jenova's, and yes, get the tinfoil hats out, it's time. What if that original body that we see of Jenova's isn't Jenova's body at all? If J.E.N.O.V.A does turn out to be a virus or a parasite or something akin to either of those things, it's possible that the way J.E.N.O.V.A works is it gets itself a host first. Which would mean that the body of J.E.N.O.V.A could be one of two things. It could be one of the Cetra, that when J.E.N.O.V.A first landed on the planet, we know that J.E.N.O.V.A corrupted the Cetra and started showing them visions of their own friends and family members and, tricking them into falling under J.E.N.O.V.A's influence. It could be one of those bodies. But it could also be a body from the previous planet that J.E.N.O.V.A took over, essentially. Now, yeah, I know, tinfoil hat time, it's a bit crazy. But, like I say, there are some things that hint towards it. Like, if we look at J.E.N.O.V.A, look at J.E.N.O.V.A's physiology, you see, like, the torso's pretty normal-ish, but it's once you get beyond the waist down, it kind of changes into, like, an amorphous heart-type situation. Everything from, like, the waist down becomes just a bit of a mess. And we have seen similar to this before. When you look at Sephiroth in the North Crater in Final Fantasy VII, he's kind of floating above everybody in that crystal, and when you look at him, what do you see? You see his upper torso and everything like that's fine. When you get to his waist, you can see some weird stuff's going on there. Could this be the process of J.E.N.O.V.A taking over Sephiroth and turning Sephiroth into the new host for J.E.N.O.V.A? It's a possibility. It makes sense in some ways, it kind of falls short in other ways, but it is possible that J.E.N.O.V.A, rather than being, and I'm not saying that this is something that they consciously thought of back then, but looking at how everything's kind of panned out since then, it'd make sense. So rather than being directly in control of Sephiroth, the J.E.N.O.V.A cells grant him the power that he needs, but it also pushes its basic instincts onto Sephiroth. Because, they're kind of becoming this new creature, and this could be why we see Sephiroth working to essentially replicate J.E.N.O.V.A's previous journey to Gaia. It could also be that Sephiroth has just decided to do this to continue his mother's legacy. But it's a little bit coincidental, don't you think? Everyone that's been affected by Jenova pretty much in some way plays out one of these two base instincts. Either the instinct to gather, and in the original game, the point that they're gathering to is Sephiroth at the North Crater. So at that point, it could be that Sephiroth has already pretty much become the host for Jenova, near enough completely, and that's why all of the body parts are kind of gathering back towards him to become complete again, and then try and enact Jenova's, the plan. The plan, the strat. So yeah, what you end up with is essentially a Sephiroth that's going to be a new host for J.E.N.O.V.A and will continue that plan, but rather than being directly controlled by J.E.N.O.V.A, he's still got his own plans and his own goals, so he can still do his own thing, but at the base of it, his instincts have become J.E.N.O.V.A's. His goals and his survival desires and things like that have all become J.E.N.O.V.A's, which is why the plan's the same, the reunion's going on, etc, etc. This is why he's messing with Cloud as much as he does, because from what we've seen of Sephiroth, he doesn't seem like the type of person in Crisis Core and things like that to mentally play with his foes and his enemies, whereas as soon as Jenova gets introduced into the picture, and like I said earlier, Jenova was always there as far as Sephiroth goes, but I think it comes down to this weakened mental state thing, where the trauma of finding out the truth made it so Jenova could actually do what it needed to do to Sephiroth to begin the process of becoming a host. Like I say, a lot of these theories are going to cross over with each other, and we're going to go over that in a second. But it does beg the question, is this the final fate of Sephiroth? To be entirely consumed and converted to Jenova? But anyway, that leads us to the final possibility. This one's a pretty simple one. This one's kind of like the first one. A little bit boring, but, you could still get a good narrative out of it. This is that Sephiroth has always been in charge, since day one. Now, the way that this comes about is if Jenova was a phenomenally powerful being, but was a phenomenally powerful being that died back when the Cetra defeated her. Sephiroth therefore just has the powers of Jenova, but there isn't really any living Jenova, it's just the use of the genetic material. maybe like in the neither is in charge theory that we've just gone over previously, we do get some degree of crossover where the base instincts of Jenova are pushed onto any being that has Jenova cells, which is why we see the reunion clones and Sephiroth acting the way they do. But overall, it's just genetic echoes, and the real power would lie with Sephiroth, who has gradually learned to utilize Jenova rather than being overpowered by the base instincts of a long dead life form. And this would almost guarantee that Sephiroth would be the final battle. He probably would end up going crazy and fusing himself with Jenova too much, you know, in a Hojo-esque kind of way. Something like that, I don't know. Maybe if he gets desperate, he'll give himself up and kind of allow himself to be mutated by Jenova. I don't know. It could be anything really, but I think if it does turn out that Jenova is just an inert life form that has just been used for experimentation, Sephiroth's in charge in that situation. But yeah, that's the 4 main possibilities that I can think of. If I'm going to be honest, the second or third are probably my favourites. The first one that we get where, you know, Jenova's always in charge, that doesn't feel very interesting. It takes away a lot of Sephiroth's agency and importance to the story. It absolves him of any responsibility. I don't like that one. And in the same way, Sephiroth always being in charge, I feel like Jenova's a bit too interesting to just be that. Do you know what I mean? I feel like there's more to Jenova than just to be a clump of cells that got experimented on and there's nothing to it. Because we do see, you know, living Jenova material summoned by Sephiroth in the original game, and we see it in Remake as well. So there's got to be something to it. There's got to be something to Jenova. I'm kind of leaning on the second or the third theory as being my favourites. The neither is in charge theory potentially is the most interesting because it kind of feeds into the downfall of Sephiroth, and it would come to its completion with Sephiroth finally just giving in and basically becoming Jenova, becoming the new host for Jenova. It puts a few more interesting layers on Jenova as well, I think, for it to be very much a the thing kind of life form. I'd enjoy that, I'd appreciate that. It could still be intelligent, you know, if it is just a cluster of cells, for example. It doesn't have to be unintelligent, it could easily have a conscious intelligence. It just remains to be seen which route we go down with it. But it's not just about what I think. Let me know what you think. Which one of these 4 possibilities do you think is the most likely? Do you have your own possibilities? If I'm going to be honest with you, it's probably going to be a mix of a lot of these. Like, there are a lot of things that are going to cross over. I think the weakened mental state definitely plays into that. It's a tough one. Let me know what you think in the comments below, though. Tell me where you're at with this whole thing. Because if we can figure out what's going on with Jenova, I feel like we can figure out a big chunk of the story. I am probably going to put a few more Jenova vids out over the next few weeks, because there's a lot to think about and talk about as far as Jenova goes. But that's going to be the end of this one. So, like I said, don't forget to leave what you're thinking in the comments. If you've got any other theories, leave them in the comments. If you've got any requests for videos, leave them in the comments. But more importantly than anything, have a great day.